So hi everybody. I guess two thank yous. Thank you to the committee for the honourable mention, and thanks for everyone for showing up. I'm Stuart Hallifax, a PhD student from the University Jean Moulin in Lyon in France, and I'm here to talk to you about a study that we ran sometime last year about looking into the effects of what it is in different people and different users, why they like different game elements, and how we can leverage this for tailored gamification. So, a bit of background before we get right into the topic. We know gamification as the use of game elements in non-game situations to increase motivation, engagement, things like that. We also know that gamification works best when it's tailored to individual preferences, individual users. An example of this is that a lot of people don't like scoring systems in games, in systems, but they might like badges which show different levels of achievement, different levels of rewards. When I first started my PhD, I obviously did a load of background research into what these different gamification studies and the different results that they show. So there are many studies that are in the topic of tailored gamification. And from this, we kind of distilled four major observations. The first being that all these different studies use different ways to implement, to exemplify the game elements they use. The example that I showed earlier about points and badges, some studies will just simply say, we used a reward system. Well, the actual question of points and badges can be a very important one. The second is that in tailored gamification, there are so many ways to categorize and identify your different learners, different users. The problem is that these categorizations could have an impact on how we consider the groups. The third is that when people do use things like, say, for example, player types that we talked a bit about yesterday, there are many varied examples of people using dominant player types to categorize their participants, their users. And finally, all of these different tailored gamification studies are all carried out in different domains and user activities. They can range from things like in health, education, sport, those kind of things. With all this being said, these four observations, it's very difficult to draw generalized conclusions for reusing these observations, these results in design in different fields. And that's why we decided to run a large-scale study to identify the motivational impact of game elements. We decided to use a crowdsourced study. We got over 300 participants. We used a game element classification to try and understand how these different instances would impact the different motivations. We also tried to keep our studies as context independent as possible. And we'll get a bit more into that about how we did it and what the design choices we made behind that. We used 3 different types of user classifications to try and compare the strengths and the weaknesses of each one. And we use a paired comparison protocol to make the task slightly easier for our participants. Now, before we get into a bit more about the results and our findings of the study, I want to talk a bit about our paired comparison protocol. We essentially presented our participants with 2 situations and asked a very simple question: which situation would motivate you more to use the system in a forced choice system? We used a total of 12 game elements, which led to 66 comparisons, which is a longer task than many other studies of this same nature, but the paired comparison protocol offers many advantages over things like direct rating through Likert scales and things like that. It's less cognitively demanding for the participant because all they have to do is compare 2 systems. They don't have to rate in absence of anything else. It also avoids things like normalization issues, which can occur when people tend to avoid extreme results or even the results in the middle because they want to provide a choice. And finally, it also offers lower measurement error. Again, looping back to the simple task, yes, it's long, but it's a lot simpler for the participants. Now, what I'm going to do for the next part of the presentation is take each of these observations, explain the research question that we put in place behind it, and then the design choices either in the study or in the analysis that we then used. So if you remember, our first observation was that the different implementations of game elements. We asked, very simple question, do these different game elements implementing same motivational strategies have different impacts on how the participants rated or perceived the motivation impact from the game elements? Well, for this, we decided to use a structured motivational strategy and game element classification as a way of structuring our ideas. This was based on all the related work that we found in the field of tailored gamification. It essentially has 2 parts to this classification. There's a high-level motivational strategy element, which is These are ideas and concepts that we want to put in our gamified system that are too abstract or too high level to be directly implemented as per se. So for example, these are things like rewards, goals, progress, social interaction. The level underneath is the lower level actual game elements that implement these different motivational strategies. So for example, the example of this is rewards can be implemented using badges, points, useful rewards. Goals can be implemented as external goals or goals that we can set for ourselves. So from here we have two different levels that structure how we designed our elements. What we did is we took the average ratings scores for each game element and compared them with the game elements from the same motivational strategies per the participants. As you can see, the rating scores are vastly different for the game elements in the same strategies, meaning that the actual game elements themselves had different impacts, were rated differently depending on inside the same strategies. For our second observation, the different categorizations of users, we asked the question, well, how does which categorization works better to understand how participants, how users react to game elements in tailored gamification? We compared 3 categorization methods that we found in the related work. So there's BrainHex, Hexad, which obviously a lot of you know, and Big Five, which is a more general personality trait system. We then used a partial least square modeling approach to determine the influences between the profile scores for each of our categorization systems, and then the scores for the ratings for the different game elements. And if you don't know how PLS works, it works in a kind of way where normally you could draw correlations between, say, for BrainHex, we take the achiever score, we can see how this score relates to the different scores for different game elements. Instead of comparing them individually, we compare them all the same. So it gives these almost impossible to understand graphics of how all these things interrelate and correlate. But essentially, it boils down to tables that look a bit like this. The things that are highlighted in red or green are the statistical the significant levels. So things that are highlighted in red or green are significant at the 0.5 level. And this shows that, just from comparison, the 2 player type models, the 2 ones that are actually related to player types, they have more influences and more relations to how the game elements are scored. And then we took that a bit further and said, okay, so between BrainX and Hexad, these do have influences. We took a bit further and then compared them with the actual definitions in the original works about what these different dimensions mean. And we found that Hexad definitions were a lot more coherent with the relationships that we found vis-a-vis the game element ratings. For our third observation, that when people used Hexad and BrainHex, they used the dominant player types, we asked, is it sufficient to differentiate users based on their preferences? So what we did is we clustered our users based on their dominant player types, identified which of the different dimensions for each of the for the 2 player classifications, identified which of the dimensions scored highest for each participant, grouped them into the different corresponding groups, and then used Kendall's coefficient of agreement to determine the agreement inside each cluster, essentially determining whether people that were of a same player type voted the same way for the different game elements. Again, here are our results. We do go a bit more in-depth in the paper. But as we can see, just from a quick overview, general agreement is situated around 0.15, 0.10, so it's very low, so we can see that the dominant player type clusters don't really agree on which game elements they find motivating or at least preferable. For our final observation, the different domains in user activity, we asked the question, to which extent does this context, does this domain have an impact on the motivational impact of game elements? Well, for this, we decided to use context-independent storyboards, and we saw this earlier with the paired comparison protocol, but essentially our storyboards looked a bit like this. So we had, on the left-hand side, we had a space that was reserved for the task area that we'd find in a normal system, and on the right-hand side, we had the space for the game elements. Now, we did run a pre-test study to ensure that participants understood these as well as more contextualized storyboards, and we found that the participants could understand them as well as the contextualized storyboards. And then what we did is we took our results and compared them with 6 other papers that used similar approaches. The papers were in the health and education fields, and we found multiple differences between our results and those found in those papers. Between our results and those in the specific context, But something we also observed was there was differences in the results between the contexts. And finally, one very interesting finding that we had was from 2 studies that were in the same context, in the health context, using the Big Five classification, we also found differences between them as well. So, based on all our findings, based on all these observations, we've come up with a few takeaways which we can use for designing new tailored gamification systems. The first being that, yes, we should use Hexad to classify users for tailored gamification. However, we shouldn't use Hexad in the way that we use the dominant player types. We should try to create profiles based on a combination of these different dimensions, with special regards to the socializer, achiever, disruptor, and free spirit dimensions, as these seem to have the most influences on how people rated scores. Now, for specific game elements, we can't really recommend game elements in all and any situations. That being said, there are some preferences, some impacts that seem to transcend the specific context. Specifically, the socializer and disruptor, they seem to enjoy, or at least feel more motivated by social interaction and progress regardless of the context. However, for the free spirit and achiever dimensions, their links seem to be more context dependent. And as a general rule of thumb, if you want to use different game elements in let's say, a non-threatening, non-disruptive way, badges and schedules seem to work for all users in all contexts. Things like self-goals and useful rewards seem to be highly context-dependent, and unfortunately, points and timers generally were regarded as the worst and the least motivating game elements. So I thank you all for paying attention to this presentation. Now field any questions.
That was a lot of data. All right, so who's got the first question?
Hi, Vero van Abele, KU Leuven. The timers and points, should they be avoided, or were they the least liked, but perhaps still liked? Because in your preference ranking, it's always relative, of course.
Yes. I don't think that any game elements should be avoided. I think it's more of a case of you need to take more care with these ones for who you are designing for. They are very dependent on things, how the person is, how the participant is going to be, and I think that they do work for some very specific people, and the whole idea is finding these very specific people.
Okay, but did you? Maybe it's in the paper, did you find testimonies of people disliking them, or did they just end up at the bottom of your preference ranking?
Unfortunately, the way we set up the study design, we couldn't get actual sort of textual feedback from our users. It is a limitation of our study design that we force people to make decisions, and we discuss it more in length in the paper, but it is possible that the timers could have been just regarded as neutral, but then ended up in the bottom of the rating anyway. So,
okay. Thank you.
Another question over here.
Great talk, thank you. Blake Williford, Texas A&M. One of the things, I don't know if you discussed this or not, but did you really look at the complexity of games? Because, games have a huge variety and complexity. So GTA 5 on one side and then Tetris on another side. So how can you make a generalized statement about, which game elements you should use in that sense,
Yeah, I completely agree. That's why we're trying to focus more on actual gamification. So looking at the problem is when you have games like GTA or Tetris, there are so many different game elements that are interacting, and it's very hard to make a decision and make an idea about what it is about these specific elements. Is it the elements themselves, or is it the interactions they have between them which motivate people? So that's why we sort of, okay, let's take a step back, and let's look at the actual ingredients, the bare bones atoms that we can put in these systems, and try to get an understanding about, on a very microscopic level, how they can influence people. So yes, I do agree that there's a lot more research to be looked into this, because there's a whole idea of, well, if there's a point system that also feeds into a leaderboard, well, that's two types of progress comparison. How does that work together? So there is an argument to be said that game elements considered independently are completely different when you try to match them together and put them together in different contexts.
I mean, it's definitely a challenging area.
100%.
Okay, we've got time for one more question while Dimitri is setting up. Up back.
Adrian Schneider, Queen's University. I'm wondering about the rewards. I guess the others too, but the rewards in particular. To what extent did you ensure that they were independent? Because off the top of my head, if you can see progress toward earning badges, for example, then you could see the progress as being a form of points. So you've got some kind of combination rather than them being truly independent. So how sure are you that they were entirely independent?
Again, we cover this a bit more in the paper. It's through our initial design process, we actually had a different set of storyboards that we tested that had completely different designs, and through feedback from the people that we interviewed said, please describe this storyboard to us. We found that some of them were not misunderstood, but slightly encroaching on different game elements. So then we reworked the design to be able to more clearly exemplify what we mean by points and badges and things like that. So yeah, that definitely was one of our considerations and one of our worries, because obviously taking this decontextualized approach, you need to ensure that people really understand the message that you're putting forward. So we do cover that a bit more in the paper.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now it is getting a bit close to lunchtime. So Dimitri, Alex,